The King and the Corpse. Long ago and far away, there was a king, a good king. His people loved him for his strength and generosity, but also because he listened to them. He held a public forum where anyone could come forth to greet the king, present an issue, or make an offering. Over the years, the king entertained many people who came to speak their mind and offer gifts to him. One of the people who came every day was a sadhu, a wandering beggar monk. For 10 years he had visited the forum and presented the king with an offering of fruit. The king always accepted the gift and handed it to his treasurer, who tossed it through the tiny window of the treasury without bothering to open the treasury door. This continued every day, with the sadhu offering the fruit in silence and walking away, and the king and treasurer not giving any thought to the fruit piling up under the tiny window of the treasury. One day, a pet monkey from the woman's apartments in the palace got loose and found its way into the forum about the same time as the sadhu arrived. As the sadhu handed over the fruit, the monkey jumped up onto the arm of the throne. The king offered the monkey the fruit, and when the monkey bit into it, a jewel fell out and rolled across the floor. The king's eyes grew wide. He turned to his treasurer. "What did you do with the fruit?" The treasurer rushed to the treasury door, unlocked it, and looked in the corner under the tiny window. There was a huge pile of fruit in various states of decay, and a jumble of precious jewels. The king was pleased, but not because he wanted more riches. He let the treasurer have the jewels. The king was curious about the sadhu, who had left before he could question him. The next day, as usual, when he came and offered the fruit, the king refused the offering and had the sadhu talk to him in private. "Tell me, what is the meaning of your fruit offering?" The sadhu answered, "Just as the fruit contained a jewel within, I sensed a precious spirit within you, just waiting for the right moment to ripen for a special quest. I am in need of a brave and noble warrior to aid me. I need your skill with a sword, your ear for listening, and your arms and legs for climbing. Only a king such as you can help me. Meet me at dusk on the night of the next new moon at the funeral ground on the edge of the city." The king didn't usually go to that part of his city, because that's where they cremate the dead and hang criminals. But he was undaunted and agreed to meet the sadhu there. On the day of the new moon, the king prepared his sword and wrapped himself in a dark cloak and set out alone. When he arrived at the burial ground, he heard the eerie sounds of the restless spirits and demons that hovered and feasted in the remains of the dead. There was no light except the glowing embers of the smoldering funeral pyres, and he could see the ghouls feeding on the blackened skeletons. But he was not afraid, and he continued to the place where he would meet the sadhu. There the king found him, drawing a magic circle on the ground with a stick. The king said, "Here I am. Tell me more about this quest and how I can assist you." The sadhu pointed and said, "You must traverse the length of the burning grounds. Seek the tree with a corpse hanging from its limbs. Cut down the corpse and bring it to me." The king replied, "Why do you need the corpse?" seeking some reason for this strange task. "That corpse is key to my work, and now you must go." The king was curious what the sadhu was up to, but was happy to help, so he marched through the burial grounds in the dark with all the creepy sounds and putrid smells. He walked for so long that he couldn't recall how far he had come when the tree with the hanging corpse came into view. He climbed up the tree and cut the rope with his sword. The corpse fell to the ground, and it let out a moan as if it had been hurt. The king checked the corpse, but as he looked closer, he could see the body had been dead for a long time. When the king reached out his hand to touch the corpse, a shrill laugh came cackling out of its throat. The king jumped back, and it dawned on him that the corpse was inhabited by a ghost. "What are you laughing at?" the king demanded. And the instant he spoke, the corpse flew back up to the limb of the tree. The king took a moment to take in what just happened, and then climbed up, cut the corpse down again. This time he picked up the corpse and threw it over his shoulder, and started to walk back to the sadhu without saying a word. He hadn't gone far when the ghost and the corpse began to speak. "Oh, king, would you like to hear a story to pass the time?" The king didn't reply. The corpse continued, "I'll take your silence as a yes. Once upon a time, there was a certain prince out hunting with companions. In the forest, the prince and his friends lost track of the rest of the group. One of his friends lost track of the rest of the group. As they strolled aimlessly through the forest, they came upon a pleasant lake. They stopped to rest, and the prince and friend saw a beautiful maiden bathing on the far side of the lake with her own entourage. She caught sight of the prince and sent him some secret signals. The prince didn't understand, but his friend did. She had revealed the name of herself, her family, and her kingdom, and also that she took a liking to the prince. Then she vanished into the trees with her group. The next day, the prince and friend went hunting again. They separated themselves from the rest of the hunting party and sought out the girl's kingdom. They found lodging with an old woman whom they bribed to take a message to the girl. The girl was able to send a secret message back to the prince for a time and a place to meet. In 2 days' time, the prince was to climb over a wall, cross a garden, and climb up the tree and into the girl's window. The two delighted in each other's company, but she was distressed that it was the prince's friend who had deciphered her signals. At the lake, she worried that his friend would tell others of her love for the prince, and that her family would disapprove. Without telling the prince, she made a plan to poison his friend. The prince's friend had foreseen this, and he came up with a scheme to foil her plan. He disguised himself as a sadhu and persuaded the prince to play as one of his pupils. Together they traveled to visit the king of the land where the girl lived. This king was in grief because his infant son had recently died. The friend, dressed up as the sadhu, convinced the king that this was the work of a witch, and that the girl was that witch. The girl was condemned to death. She was left outside the gates of the city, naked and chained, where wild animals were soon to devour her. As soon as no one was in sight, the prince and friend rode up on horses and freed her. They returned to the prince's kingdom, where they were happily married. The girl's family knew nothing of this, and thinking their child eaten by wild animals, died themselves of broken hearts. The corpse paused a moment and then asked the king, "Who was guilty of the death of the girl's parents? If you know the answer and do not reply, your head will burst into 100 pieces." The king thought he knew, but was afraid to answer, knowing the corpse would fly back to the tree. Yet he didn't like the idea of his head blowing up, so he gave his answer. Neither the maid nor the prince was guilty because they were in love, and neither was the friend who was fulfilling his duty to protect the prince. The only one who is guilty is the king of the girl's country, because he let these things come to pass within his realm. His grief blinded him. He didn't see the prince and friend coming as strangers in his land or recognize they were in disguise. And he was too quick to believe the blaming of the girl for his son's death. A king should be all-knowing, the all-knowing protector of his people, for he failed in his kingly duty. With this last word from the king, The corpse moaned in mock agony and vanished. The king sighed and started back to the tree. He walked back, climbed up, cut down the corpse, and threw it over his shoulders again. And after a short while, the corpse started up again. "My dear sir, you have encumbered yourself with a difficult and curious task. Permit me to tell you another tale, to pass the time. Maybe this time things will turn out differently. Once upon a time, there were 3 young Brahmins who all lived in the home of their guru. All 3 were brothers, and all 3 were spiritual seekers. But they had fallen in love with the guru's daughter. The guru didn't want to marry her off to any one of them, for fear of hurting the other 2. But then, as fate would have it, the daughter became ill and died. All 3 of the men deeply grieved her death, and together they carried her body to the funeral pyre. After the fire went out, and all three men dealt with their grief in different ways. The first one decided to wander the world as a sadhu. The second man decided to gather the bones of his beloved from the ashes and wash them in the holy waters of the Ganges River. The third brother decided to stay right there with her by building a hut over her ashes and sleeping there every night. The first brother wandered for many days, and in meeting other sadhus, came upon one who had discovered a magic charm in a book that could bring someone back from the dead. He borrowed the book and made his way back to the home of the guru. Just as he was arriving, the second brother was returning from the Ganges with the bones. The 3 brothers agreed to revive her, placing the bones on the ashes and reciting the spell. And then, in a puff of smoke, in a blinding light, she appeared before them, alive and as radiant as ever. "Now," the corpse said to the king, "to whom does she belong? Don't forget, if you know and don't say, your head will explode." The king couldn't help having an idea of what was right, so he was forced to reply. The first brother, who found the magic spell that brought her to life again, acted as a father to her. The second, by performing the pious service of washing her bones, had performed the pious duty of a son. But the one who refused to leave her and slept on her ashes, he acted as her spouse, and so she belongs to him. With the king's last word, the corpse was gone, and back on the tree as before. Once again the king went back, climbed and cut and hoisted the corpse on his back, and tramped across the funerary grounds. The corpse broke the silence again. "Good king, another tale for you. Once there were 2 young men who had been friends their whole life. There was also a woman who was arranged to marry one of them, and although it saddens me to say, they were not particularly happy to be chosen to marry. After the wedding, the newlyweds and the friend traveled to the ancestral lands of the bride's parents. On their way, they came upon a temple to Kali, the great goddess of life and death. The husband wanted to pray, and so went into the temple alone. Once inside, he was overcome with an emotion and felt compelled to sacrifice himself to the goddess by cutting off his head with his sword. After a while, the friend came in to retrieve the husband, but when he finds his friend lying in a pool of blood, he too is inspired and cuts off his own head. Finally, the bride comes into the temple. When she has seen what has happened, she runs out of the temple intending to hang herself. When just then the voice of Kali herself speaks to her, instructing her to go back and replace the heads back on the bodies of the 2 men, with the promise that they will be restored to life. When the woman does this, she's so distraught that she places the wrong head on each of the bodies. The friend's head is on the husband's body. The husband's head is on the friend's body. "Now," says the corpse, "to which one is she now married? Is she married to the one with the husband's head, or the one with the husband's body?" The king wanted to stay silent, but he was trapped again because he thought he knew. So he replied, The head is supreme among the members of the body. She is married to the one with the husband's head." The king stopped, turned around, and went back to the tree. There the corpse was hanging again. The king and corpse spent the better part of the night this way. 23 times the king cut down the corpse. 23 times he reluctantly, yet thoughtfully replied to the corpse's questions about the tales with their tangled, twisted plots, about the troubles of human life. Now the night is still dark. The graveyard demons lurk and prowl, and the corpse begins another story. Dear king, here's another tale for you, one you have not heard, from a distant land and from another time. There was a chieftain and his son. The father was widowed, and the son was an adult, but had not yet married. One day, they were out hunting and came upon 2 sets of footprints. Father and son were both skilled in tracking, and they could tell that these tracks belonged to 2 women. But not only that, they could tell the tracks belonged to a mother and daughter of noble birth. The father and son surmised that the 2 women were fleeing danger, that something had happened to their king, and so they agreed to track these women down and then marry them. They agreed that the father would marry the woman with the bigger feet, and the son would marry the woman with the smaller feet. When they found the women, most of their guesses were confirmed. The women were queen and princess, and their king had died. The woman agreed to marry the 2 men, but it turned out the queen's feet were smaller than the princess's feet. Father and son had sworn an oath on it, so the son married the queen, and the father married the princess with big feet. The 4 of them returned to the men's village, marry, and in due time both women give birth to 2 sons. "Now," says the corpse, "how are these 2 babies related to each other?" The king pondered this. He thought of it from the perspective of the babies. If I was the chieftain's baby, then my dad's son's son would be my nephew. But then again, I would also be the princess's baby. And my mom's son would be my uncle. And if I think of myself as the adult son's baby, then my dad's son would be my uncle. But then again, also being the queen's child, my mom's daughter's son would be my nephew. These 2 babies are a real paradox. The king began to wonder about the other stories, too. The corpse had told him, and how you could look at them in more than one way. He thought of the old couple who had died from grief at the loss of their daughter. Maybe it wasn't just the king's fault for letting the prince and friend into his kingdom in disguise. He thought of the 3 Brahmin brothers, and how maybe each one had loved the guru's daughter equally, yet differently. And he thought back to husband and friend who had sacrificed themselves to Kali. Maybe the heart was just as important as the head. Indeed, the king proclaimed the truth exceeds a single simple answer. The king was happy, and the corpse didn't fly away, so he carried him on his back jauntily. The corpse spoke again, commending the king for his night of labor, how he fearlessly carried the corpse, and listened carefully to the tales, and answered honestly. The corpse said, "Listen closely, king. Soon I will leave this body, and you will bring it to the sadhu. I warn you that his intentions are devious. He wants to cast a spell that will trap me in this course and fashion me into a god. He will then ask you to kneel and worship me, and then he will sacrifice you." The corpse gave him some advice, and then left the corpse. Spirit left the corpse. The king returns to the sadhu and presents the corpse to him. The sadhu knew it would take a long time, so he wasn't surprised, and he had used the time to prepare for his magical working. He had drawn the magic circle in the ground, made visible by the ghastly light of candles made from corpse fat. The corpse was laid in the circle, whereupon the sadhu began to recite incantations. The ghost returned to the corpse as he had foretold. "Look what I have done! Look what I have done," said the sadhu. "With your help, O king, I have made a new life, and this being will be a new god for your kingdom." "I see," said the king. "I would like to kneel and worship this new god, but as a king I am not used to such practice. Could you demonstrate the proper way to prostrate?" The sadhu knelt down and pressed his forehead on the ground. The king took out his sword and chopped the sadhu's head off. At this strike, the ghost was free of the corpse, and a whole chorus of ghosts and ghouls cried out in joy, for the sadhu had trapped them there for years. The ghost asked the king how he would like to be honored for his great work. "All that I ask," the king said, "is that my story be told, and the 24 tales be preserved, so others may be liberated." Dawn was breaking as the king left the funerary grounds and began to walk back to his palace.